Hey there, welcome to Synth Seeker. My name's Luke. Continuing the exploration of the Push 3, or I guess just the Ableton Push now, since it's the only one available. They're not calling it the 3. I had some questions that were asked about audio latency. So this video is just going to give you some details of how I've got the audio system set up with the Push here. I'm using an external interface. I'll give you all the details, how I'm running through ADAT. And I've seen some videos complaining that the latency can be high with external hardware. I'm using all external hardware for the most part. And I have no issues with latency. So bottom line on top, I think it's entirely dependent on your synths, because the MIDI implementation of your synth, how well they if they add latency when they receive the MIDI note commands, basically saying, okay, execute, play a note, and then it's heavily dependent on the audio interface you're using. I am not using the internal encoders. I'm using an external one and sending it over through ADAT. I haven't explored the internal ones yet. And I don't actually anticipate ever doing so, because I have a buttload of external hardware, and the whole point is that I want to either use the external hardware through an interface, or I'm going to use internal sounds from the Push itself. I don't ever plan on taking external hardware into the Push's audio inputs. I'm always going to use an external device. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the Push's internal encoders. I need more channel inputs than 2, basically. I think they're probably fine, but your mileage may vary. You're going to have to experiment with that, or rely on someone else to do those tests, because I'm not doing those tests. Today we're going to talk about how I use an external encoder to deal with this. And my latency, I can't get a physical number. I could record a loop, freeze it, and then pull it over and look at, zoom in and look at how many milliseconds off that initial note is. I'm going to rant just a little bit. There's a lot of videos out there about dealing with latency in your DAW. And the majority of them all do this, some variant of the sort of test where they render some MIDI data out to their synth and then back in through their encoders. And then they look at the waveform and they measure in milliseconds how far from the start of the bar to when the note actually starts to fire. There's nothing wrong with running that test, but most people, certainly me, I can't detect latencies less than about 12 milliseconds when I'm playing. Okay, if the round trip from MIDI note leaves the Push, out the interface to the synth, generates sound, comes back to the encoder, comes back into live, be it in the Push or on the laptop. If that round trip time is less than about 12 milliseconds, I'm fine with that. I don't notice it. Now, some people are going to say, oh, but you can get like phase cancellation issues and your stuff doesn't hit as hard because, the bass and the kick can interfere and, cause phase problems. That may be true, but at the level that I'm working, right? I am an amateur musician making my own music and releasing it myself. Use your ears. I listen for phase cancellation. I listen for phase problems in the low end and across the whole track. I have a guy who does mastering for me who listens for that stuff. You don't need to go in necessarily with your surgical tools and detect that stuff before you even begin working on your project. Just work on your music. And then as you are developing your music, listen and have other ears listen. And if you hear those problems, you address them then. Trying to tweak your audio latency before you ever even start recording anything, just so you know it's good, finger quotes good, that's a form of what's called early optimization, and it's a waste of time because there's so many variables that can be introduced for latency. The effects you choose, the synth implementation for MIDI, the synth implementation for how that synth makes it sound. The audio interface you're using encoder-wise, it's all so variable that there's no point, it's a waste in doing that up front unless you are a pro and you need to be able to state the metrics around your system's performance to your clients in order to have them come spend tens of thousands of dollars with you. I can understand that as a business need. But if you're like me, watching YouTube videos, you got a synth collection, you've got a push, Ableton, and some gear, you're wasting your time and you're preventing yourself from making music. So don't early optimize, all right? So this video, I'm just going to explain what's working good enough for me. I can't detect any noticeable latency when I'm playing, given my rig. So let's talk about what my rig is, and you can insert pieces of the puzzle, change things around for your rig, and see how you're going to do. All right. I'll get off my soapbox now. All right. Don't waste time. Go make music, and buy more synths. I had to get that in there. That's the catchphrase, right? Okay. So what's happening here? I use Motu. MOTU, Mark of the Unicorn is what that stands for, but Motu audio interfaces. And what I'm using with the push is an old interface. It's probably 10 years old, called an ultralight AVB. Okay. Essentially it's got 8 channels in, 6 line channels, and then mics or instrument level inputs. And it will spit out an ADAT, 8-channel ADAT signal, which is running into the push. Okay. And so I've got ADAT coming from the Motu into the push. I've got ADAT leaving the push and going into the Motu, because as I said in the previous video, the Motu wants to be, from an audio sync perspective for how ADAT is synced, it wants the push to be the leader and the Motu interface to be the follower. Okay. So your syncing is your interface is following the push, and that requires having 2 ADAT cables connected, and out of there into the push and an out of the push into the interface. Okay. Now, your interface may not need that, but the synths I am using in this example today, I've got a Nord Wave 2. I've got a third wave from Groove Synthesis, which is, I just refer to it as the PPG because it's basically a PPG modern. And then I've got a Novation Summit. Okay, so these are all relatively large, monolithic, flagship-y kind of synths. Their MIDI implementation is pretty good. It varies from synth to synth. Like Third Wave's MIDI implementation is pretty new, but they keep updating the firmware. But from a latency perspective, it's okay. It's very playable. I haven't detected any noticeable latency in any of those synths, Nord, Third Wave, Summit. Okay. And so the way I've got this set up, you're not going to be able to see this very well. And this isn't meant to be a guide. I'm just talking you through my rig and how the latency is working. I'm coming out the pushes 3.5 inch MIDI, the 3.5 inch tip ring sleeve MIDI. It's running out, okay? It's running straight out into a plain old MIDI cable that's running down into a splitter, okay? My splitter is from the MIDI Solutions Company. It's a Canadian company. A splitter's, I think, $60 or $70 US. It's called a quadra through. And then that is splitting my MIDI signal out to my 3 synths. And the Nord is listening on channel 2, the Third Wave is listening on channel 3, and the Novation Summit is listening on channel 4. All right. So when I go to my tracks in Ableton, when I go to my tracks on the push, which is running Ableton under the hood, okay, I'm using an external instrument device, and that device is for the Nord is set to send on channel 2, and it's receiving audio input from the Motu audio interface. Now, how is the audio routed? Each synth is sending a stereo pair over to the Motu. The Motu has 6 inputs in the back, so every 2 inputs is for one of the synths. So the Nord sends a left-right, it's coming here. The Third Wave sends a left-right, it's coming here. the summit sends a left-right, and it's coming here. Then the ADAT, I've also got the microphone set up and a guitar input that I'm not using. All right. Those 8 channels, 6 of which are for the synths, are coming across on the ADAT cable into the push. On the external instrument device, it's like for the Nord is MIDI channel 2 out, and the audio in is on the push. When you're coming in on ADAT, the 8 channels are channels 15, 16, 14, 13, 14, 11, 12, and 9, 10. Okay, so 9 through 16. So those are the pairs, 9 and 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So I basically assign the pair to the track, to the external instrument. From a latency perspective, I hit a note, MIDI goes out, generates sound, comes back in, gets encoded, gets transferred over to the push. There's no double encoding. The actual audio to digital encoding is happening out here on the Motu, and then the digital audio is coming across on the ADAT. So it's not like the push is being asked to encode it again. So it actually reduces some CPU load, negligible amount, but the push isn't doing anything. It's just saying, here's the stream of numbers. I'm going to represent that as audio. The encoding lifting is done by the Motu. So whatever you're going to use as your audio interface, that's going to send ADAT over to the push, make sure it's of a high enough quality that it can get the job done without introducing a ton of latency. The interface is where you're going to get some latency. The other place you'll get latency is in the synth itself, the way the synth converts the MIDI note on event to audio. Some synths have higher latency. 10 years ago, 8 years ago, I had a Korg MS-20 Mini. The MIDI implementation on that has a higher latency than the MIDI implementation of other synths, okay? So I was noticing higher latencies using that. But for this rig, this is fine. You'll notice the latency when you go to hit the notes. If you don't hear the sound immediately when hitting the note, if it's really bad, right, you'll be a very detectable delay between pressing the pad and hearing the note. Where I'm sitting, I have no latency that's noticeable for me. That means it's less than 12 milliseconds. And for me, that's fine. I'm totally fine with that. And really, that's basically it, right? It's going to come down to, latency is going to come in pretty much 2 places. The note that goes out the push to your synth, that synth converts that MIDI note to audio data. There can be some latency there. It depends on the synth though. It has nothing to do with the push. Then that audio coming back is going to go through an interface. That interface is going to convert that analog audio to digital audio and then send it across ADAT to the push. That conversion can introduce some latency, all right? The travel across the wire, across the light pipe, may introduce, microseconds worth of latency latency but it's negligible. You're not going to get any latency bringing that audio into the push. All right. EEs are going to refute me, electrical engineers, right? They may say, oh, well, everything introduces latency. That's true. But an audible latency that impacts my performance, nope. It's just negligible, all right? So don't worry about it. If you're really, really concerned, like I said earlier, about things like phase cancellation and making sure that everything hits exactly right and time aligning all of those initial wave files, do that when you're doing your arrangement. You're not going to do it on the push. You're going to put it into Ableton and go manipulate it there. You can fix that stuff later. Your mastering engineers can fix phase cancellation problems, things like that. Or if you wear your own mastering engineer hat, that's fine. But latency is fine. I got no issues. Certainly when using an external interface, which I think is the majority of cases for a lot of people. All right. And as far as the internal, locally running virtual instruments, latency there is like even lower, right? So really, that's about it. I'm going to keep exploring here. Some things that I'm trying to figure out the right way or the best way to do is how to do remote mapping, right? I want to be able to use another control surface to control parameters on the devices that are in the tracks, right? You can certainly do that in Ableton with an additional MIDI controller, and then you do your MIDI mappings. I can't see a way to do that on the push. I can't find it in the manual. I suspect what I have to do is set up my mappings in Ableton on the laptop and then transfer that project over, and then my mappings will be there. That's an experiment for the next couple days. I'll let you know this weekend how that turns out. Anyway, so here, I hope this answered some questions around latency. I got no issues. If you've got serious issues about latency, post something in the comments and we can discuss it. We can take apart your rig and talk about where latency might be creeping in, because it's either at your synth from MIDI to audio conversion, or it's at your interface from audio to digital data conversion. It's not in the push, okay? If you're adding effects to the system, either MIDI effects or you're adding audio effects after the audio data comes in, you can introduce latency in both of those cases. But generally, if you're using the stock Ableton and stock Max for Live plugins, those are going to introduce like almost no latency, or generally zero latency, with a few exceptions. That's something you need to be aware of and know how your tools work. But generally, it's not an issue. All right, that's about it. I'll talk to you guys in a couple days. Have a good time. You have been watching Synth Seeker. Thanks.